Good day everyone, and welcome to this first lecture in optimization. Now in the first part of this series we're going to have a look at evolutionary algorithms. We're going to start off with an introduction to EAs and what they're all about, and then in consecutive lectures we'll look at very specific implementations of algorithms that follow this paradigm. So let's get started. I'm sure we all have a basic idea of evolution and how that is observed within biology and in nature. Perhaps two noteworthy names that I can mention is that of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, which introduced the idea of acquired traits that gets inherited from one generation to the next, and then of course that of Charles Darwin, which proposed the theory of natural selection through random mutations and survival of the fittest, etc. Now you can go and read up on these theories in more detail, but the idea is that we're going to use this as a sort of biological metaphor to try and find an algorithm that we can use to optimize problems within computer science. Which of course brings us to evolutionary computation, or EC. Now evolutionary computation refers to any computer-based problem-solving system or algorithm that uses computational models of evolutionary processes. In other words, it's inspired by evolution, such as natural selection, survival of the fittest, reproduction, as the fundamental components that's driving these computational systems. And this typically boils down to 5 key components. So let's have a look at these. The first is some kind of encoding scheme of the solution. So almost like a digital chromosome, if you will. So you need to find a way to represent the solution within this actual algorithm. And remember, this doesn't solve the problem in any way. It's not a algorithm that solves it. It's simply a representation of the solution, and that's a very important step. Then of course we need some kind of function to evaluate the fitness of the individual. In other words, given 2 or more of these solutions, you need to have a function that tells you which one is better than which, either by comparing them with one another or assigning some absolute value to the solution, so that you can then sort them and decide which of course is better than which. Then we need some kind of initialization phase. So that's your primordial soup of solutions, and because you have to start somewhere. So you have to have a way to generate random solutions. Even if they are terrible, you have to have that kind of step. It's usually just random, and it's pretty straightforward usually, but there sometimes can be some caveats that you have to be aware of. Then of course we need some kind of selection operator, which does 2 things. First of all, it decides who survives to the next iteration, because we can't just have everything survives. There's simply not enough room for that. And of course, we need a way to find out which individuals or solutions will take part in the reproduction phase. Everything can't reproduce because, again, you won't really make progress. You need to find probabilistically the stronger individuals to reproduce, and in that way pass on the strongest genes. But we'll get to that. And then of course lastly we need some kind of reproduction operator, and this takes the form typically of either some kind of crossover or mutation. So with this we take 2 or more solutions, that's now crossover of course, and you create 1 or more child offsprings, if you like, or children for those solutions that can then take those genes forward. And mutation of course, typically slight variations within an individual so that some variation is introduced in the population as well. And that in a nutshell is the driving force of evolutionary computation. Okay, so let's have a look at the generic evolutionary algorithm. And the elegance of this algorithm, I don't think it can be overstated. I love the simplicity of this. And it's usually algorithms that are small and concise like this that sometimes carry the most power. But let's see how it looks and how it works. So we have a generation counter. So that's this t equals 0. That's just to keep track of which population we are. Then we create and initialize an nx dimensional population. We're going to call that C0 or CT because of course t is 0 at this point. And it's going to consist of ns individuals. So that's the population size. So you can typically decide, let's say, we're going to have 100 solutions in our population, or 1,000, or it can be dynamic, but usually it's static in nature. And this dimensionality, this nx dimensional population, what this refers to is, let's say you've got a simple polynomial that you want to optimize. Let's say fx equals and then some polynomial follows that. And let's say you've forgotten how to differentiate and you now want to find either the maximum or the lowest point of this function given some input value x. So you're going to say fx, let's say x is 0, and fill in 0 at x's and see what your value is, and that then is the fitness. And let's say you want to maximize that. You want to find the highest point. Now, the only variable that determines what the function's output is of course x. So that's an example of a one-dimensional problem. But let's say you've got another problem. Let's say you've got a neural network that drives a simple race car around a track, a digital track perhaps, and you use a neural network to drive that process. You've got a bunch of inputs, let's say the distances to the various boundaries of the racetrack, and perhaps the acceleration and so forth. It goes through the neural network, and then the output is maybe press the brake, press the accelerator, or maybe ease on the accelerator, steer left, steer right, all those kinds of outputs. But the main driving force, of course, of neural network is the weights on the synapses. Let's say with your hidden layer, you've got 112 weights, argumentatively. Now, because you've got 112 parameters that needs to be set in this neural network, your dimensionality of that problem is 112. So the dimensionality refers to how many orders of change or how many directions of freedom do you have in the solution. That's the dimensionality. Then, of course, we start with the main loop. So while some stopping condition is not met, now there's numerous ways where you can stop. You can stop when you've got a good enough solution. You can stop when you're not making progress any longer. So in other words, the fitness is not increasing. You could even have something like while true. So keep on going forever. And that's usually used in scenarios when you don't know what the optimal solution is, or it's maybe an artificial life simulation or something like that. You just keep on going. So inside the loop, you first of all you have to evaluate the fitness. So that's this function f. That's the fitness function. So take the individual xit, okay, xi being from 0 to ns, or ns minus 1, your population size. So you evaluate the fitness of each of your individuals. So now for each individual, you also know how fit they are. Then you perform reproduction to produce offspring. So this reproduction phase, of course, will select parents in some way. So either through probabilistical ways to determine which is the fittest, and those get a higher probability to be selected. It could be random, but the point is you select parents and you create offspring. And once you've done all that, you select a new population CT plus 1. So those that will survive and those that will be culled. And then, of course, you advance to the next generation. T equals T plus 1. And wash, rinse, repeat. And this whole process keeps on repeating. And that is your generic evolutionary algorithms. And most of the other paradigms that we're going to have a look at, genetic algorithms, genetic programming, differential evolution, takes this and adapts it slightly for the purposes of that technique. But this, in essence, is the basic generic evolutionary algorithm. So as a very, very simple example of an evolutionary algorithm is of course artificial life. So what you've got here is all these different kinds of critters that you see here. Each of them has a neural network, and they've got 4 antennae, as you can see, and that antenna is placed in different positions on its body. And the representation of this is, of course, the positions of those antennae plus the weights on their internal network. That's it. And I randomly initialize this to begin with, and based on the output, they have certain actions. And of course, when they start off, you can see that it is totally random. They've got no idea what to do. They run about doing all kinds of strange actions, and the idea is that they need to find these green dots. That's their food. So they need to be able to find this and avoid the reds. And if they run over a red, it's like poison. It deducts a large portion of the energy. So that's basically the environment. And then for reproduction, if they die, you can see they fade out like that. I'm not the world's best graphics artist. So when they fade out, they die. And then I select 2 random individuals. And I take their genes. I make slight modifications to that. And a new chromosome is created. And the new individual gets born. And in this way, this just keeps on going and going. And the idea, of course, is if an individual is able to find food with some success, it will survive longer. So anything that dies off, there's a greater chance that that chromosome of that individual that was able to survive ever so slightly longer gets passed on to the next generation. And you can already see, if you look at this individual over here, it's sort of, they was able to find that green spot there again. So that's the most successful individual at this point. Look, it's not ideal, but it's better than what we've got. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let this run for a few minutes, and let's see if we can make any progress. So after one cup of coffee, you can already see quite a bit of a difference between this and the initial population. Critters there's a bit less diversity in the population, which means that the most fittest individuals were able to survive and pass on their genes, and they have dominated now this digital landscape of ours. You can see that they're much more able to find the green pieces of food. It seems like the strategy that they currently favor is to run in a circle, like this one runs in a circle, until it gets close to a piece of food. Let's see, and then it gobbles it up. So they don't go out and hunt. For some reason, that's not an optimal technique. They need to go in a circle until they find them when they're close to a piece of food. I also haven't seen them running into a red piece of poison. So it seems like they've completely solved that problem. You can also see a bit of symmetry on the antennae, which is quite interesting. And I think that might become even more pronounced if you leave this for long enough. The symmetry might be even more prominent later on in the process. But what I want you to realize from this is that this behavior was never programmed in any of these critters. I only provided a representation scheme or representation technique to say that these are the weights on the neural network, represent them as an array. The location of the antenna is in this way. Then I modeled this world of pieces of food, and you need to find food to survive. So there was a bit of modeling in that. And then I left the critters to go and, fend for themselves. And they were quite unsuccessful in the beginning, but eventually they started to discover pieces of food. And those that were able to survive a little bit longer had a greater opportunity to be selected. So when one of the critters died, more fitter individuals were able to reproduce, and that offspring was able to take that individual's place. So that's the only driving force about this. So evolutionary algorithms is an incredibly powerful technique, especially in cases where you don't have labeled data. So this could be regarded as a kind of unsupervised training, where you have a fitness function that guides the entire process. And the fitness function tells us how good a solution is, which is not necessarily always ideal. In this case, we don't even have a fitness function. It's just those that survive longer, by implication, has a better opportunity to be selected. And EA is very, very powerful when you've got problems like this. Now, as we'll see later, there are quite a number of easy paradigms that exist. We have genetic algorithms, which models genetic evolution very, very closely. It has the concept of crossover and mutation. The representation is a binary bit string usually, but of course arrays of integers are also fine with these, but it tries to mimic the evolutionary process as close as possible. Then you have genetic programming, which is based on GAs, but the individuals are programs that evolve. So it's abstract syntax trees, which is the trees, and that evolves over time. Then there's evolutionary programming, which is derived from the simulation of the adaptive behavior in evolution. So because evolution is also an evolutionary process in itself, the principles of that is applied to evolutionary programming. We have differential evolution, which is a self-correcting kind of scheme, which is incredibly interesting and powerful, because you don't have to determine how big your mutation rates and things are going to be. The algorithm itself auto adapts to that. You've got cultural evolution, which is just basically EAs with additional input data that's given to it in order to guide the whole solution. And of course, coevolution, where you have groups of individuals or subspecies or species within the population that compete with one another, or maybe even cooperate in order to solve a problem. But we're going to have a look at these later on in the module. But these are all different kinds of evolutionary computation paradigms, or different kinds of algorithms. So before we look at representation, let's quickly chat about the chromosome, because this is part of the whole inspiration behind EAs. Now, characteristics and traits in organisms are stored in long strings called chromosomes, and each of these long strings consists of millions of genes, which is the smallest unit of information, and it's actually digital. It's only 4 letters that every gene can take. So in a way, we are stored digitally, if you think about it, which is quite fascinating. And of course, you require a number of these chromosomes, each with specific information about how this organism gets coded. And the number of these chromosomes differ between organisms. For example, a human has 23 chromosome pairs, so 46 in total. A kingfisher 66, shrimp 127, and a fruit fly is 4. So it differs widely amongst living organisms. But the point is that these chromosomes, consisting of genes, explains everything about that organism. And what's so fascinating for me is if I take a piece of DNA from your toe and I take that cell and I extract those 46 chromosomes from that cell, in that chromosome I can represent or I can find information about your eye color, about your height, and all of that, because everything about you is represented in that chromosome. So you as a solution is completely encompassed within that 46 chromosomes, which I find absolutely phenomenal. And of course, this is what inspires the whole idea of representing a solution within a genetic algorithm or evolutionary algorithm per se, and then applying reproduction on it, selection on it, in order to find a solution to a problem. Now, like with our organism, where we have pairs of chromosomes that define everything about that organism, we need the same kind of digital chromosome or representation for our solution to our problem. Now, of course, we don't use pairs of chromosomes, we just use one long string. That's usually the easiest. So it's a vector or an array of a specific data type. It could be integers, it could be zeros and ones, so bits. It could even be floating point values, and it's usually of the same type. So if you have a combination of, let's say, floating point values and discrete values, you usually have to map the floating point values, but that's usually quite easy to do. But the point is that you've got this array of data types that represents the solution to your problem. And of course, genetic programming is an exception to this, as we'll see a bit later, that uses trees. So, and in fact, the trees are abstract syntax trees that's used to execute a piece of code for us. So that's the representation. And of course, a combination of these is also possible. Nothing hinders you to do that. And once you've got this, you can move on to the next part of the EA, which of course is the fitness function, the reproduction operators, etc. But this is a very, very important step, and quite often one of the most difficult parts of the algorithm. Now, once we know how to represent the solutions to the problem that we're trying to solve, we need to be able to start from some point. So, and that is the initialization phase, where we kick off this whole process. You've got this primordial soup of solutions, and then you can start the whole evolution process. Now, usually the standard technique for your initial population is just to initialize it to random values. You just have to make sure that the values that you choose are, of course, valid for that data type that you're using. So if you're using, let's say, integers, you can't put floating point values in there. You have to make sure that the values that you initialize it with is correct. And also, very importantly, that your search space is uniformly covered. What does this mean? So let's say, for example, you've got values, let's say you've got bytes that you store from 0 to 255. You can't initialize them from 0 to 128. So because what about the higher values? Usually when an area is not covered, there's a high probability that area will be neglected. And of course, you don't want that. So you want your search space to be as uniformly covered as possible, so that the algorithm can search everywhere for you. And that's your initialization phase. And once this is done, the process can kick off. Another aspect that needs to be considered during the initialization phase is, of course, the size of your population, because the size of the population is going to directly influence the computational complexity of your algorithm. And also the storage requirements. If you have a large population, so you've got lots of organisms or solutions at the same time being stored, that increases your diversity, which is fantastic. It will also require few generations to obtain a good solution because of this, this diversity that you have in the population. And also, if you have parallel processing that occurs, a large population, you can process individuals concurrently, which is of course a good advantage. But again, your computational overhead is quite a bit, and it's going to take quite a bit of memory to store all these individuals or solutions inside your memory space. Smaller populations, of course, much less diversity because it's a small population, and it also covers less of the search space as a result, and it's going to require quite a bit of generations to obtain a good solution, but progressing from one generation to the next is generally very, very fast. So that also needs to be considered. So usually the impact of the size of the population needs to be carefully considered. A good starting point is to take the dimensionality of your problem and then multiply that by 10. It's a rule of thumb. So it really depends on the complexity of the program that you want to solve, but it's one of those things that you have to, in some ways, thumb suck to get a good value for. But again, that's one of the aspects of EA. Okay, so now we can represent the solutions in some kind of representation scheme, some digital chromosome, and of course we have an initialization phase. We've got random solutions that does absolutely nothing. So what's next? The next, of course, is the fitness function. Now the purpose of the fitness function is to tell you how good a solution is, and it's a very, very important part because that drives this entire process. It not only tells us who will survive, but also which individuals has a higher probability to be used during the reproduction phase. So that's the purpose of the fitness function. Now the fitness function does not have to correspond to the objective function. The objective function is just a fancy way to determine or to describe the thing that we're trying to solve. The objective function will tell you exactly if you've got a correct solution. The fitness function can be a little bit less accurate. It only needs to be a heuristic function if you want, or an educated guess that tells us in which direction the algorithm needs to move or to change the solutions in order to find a better solution. But usually your fitness function corresponds with your objective function. Now fitness function comes in two flavors. The most common being the absolute fitness function. So here you take your chromosome, you run it through the fitness function, and it tells you 17.24. That's how good it is. It could be a maximization or a maximization function or a minimization function. So let's say we've got a polynomial that we want to try and find the minimum of. The fitness function and the objective function is the same thing. You take the polynomial, plug the x in, and as low as it goes, that's just better. So that would be a minimization function. Of course, you could also optimize where you want the fitness to be as high as possible. And it's easy to jump between the two and convert the one to the other. But an absolute fitness function, all you need to know, it gives a value to how good a solution is. And then a relative fitness function is exactly as it sounds. You take two solutions to the problem, and the relative fitness function can tell you which one is better. So let's say you're writing a program that's going to evolve a chess playing computer, a chess playing algorithm, and it needs to evolve all of those techniques like controlling the center, the value of the pieces, queen mobility, all those. It has to figure out those things itself. Then a relative fitness function, you'll typically let them play against one another, and then the result of that would to tell you which one is better than the other one. And that is a relative fitness function. You can't really give a value to it like 7.94, but you can say at least that this one is relatively better than this solution. So that's the two kinds of techniques. Of course, since EAs are so versatile, it can solve quite a few types of problems or kinds of problems. And they are typically categorized in the following 4 groups. The first, of course, is where you have what's known as an unconstrained problem. Now, an unconstrained problem is where the fitness function is the objective function. So a good example of that is where we have the polynomial that we want to find the maximum value of. Fx equals this. And you want to find the maximum value of the polynomial given some value of x. That's unconstrained. There's no constraints. You only want to plug in a value of x and get an output. So that's an example of that. Then, of course, you get a constrained kind of problem. Now here, the fitness function is the objective function combined with a constraint penalty function. So an example of that might be the knapsack problem. Now with the knapsack problem, we'll do it in more detail later on, but the knapsack problem says you've got a bag, you want to fill it with items. Let's say that items have priority or they've got value, but they each have a weight. So you want to find the most valuable bag given these items that you want to put inside the bag. So the objective function is the value of the bag needs to be as high as possible. But the fitness function is the bag needs to be as high as possible, but you are not allowed to exceed the maximum weight that that bag can carry. So now there's a constraint. So optimize the bag, make it as valuable as possible, but you cannot exceed the maximum weight. So that's a constraint problem. Then a multi-objective problem. This is where you've got multiple objectives that needs to be solved. A good example of that is, let's say you've got a EA that plays soccer. Okay, and you've got a team of players and they need to score goals. You might say, because this is a complex problem, let's combine this, all the objectives of the agents into sub-objectives. In other words, control of the ball. In other words, don't let the enemy team get access to the ball. Make sure that you are more in the your opponent's side. How many goals were you able to obtain? How many successful kicks where you pass the ball to another player, for example, where it hasn't been taken over by another player or intercepted by another player? That's multi-objectives. So in this case, your fitness function is the weighted sum of all the sub-objective functions. A weighted sum means that some objectives might be more important than others. Another example of that is a timetable. So with a timetable, you don't want, for example, clashes to occur, but then there's certain things like make more of the lectures in the morning. Don't make sure that there isn't a big enough, large enough spreads between where certain periods are scheduled and so forth. So that's a multi-objective function. And then lastly, one area where EAs totally shine is in dynamic or noisy problems. So here, the fitness function might change over time. Or there might even be a Gaussian noise component that's introduced to get some more variety in the actual fitness function itself. But the point is the fitness function needs to adapt over time in order to solve the problem. So that's a noisy problem or a dynamic problem. Okay, so now we've got a way to represent our solutions. We can even create some solutions, even though they are terrible, and we even know how terrible they are because we've got a fitness function. So, that's a good start. So what's next? Next, of course, is selection. Now, the selection function or the selection operator will be used during the selection of the new population, who survives and who dies, and also during reproduction. Now, each selection strategy, and there's quite a few of them which we're going to have a look at, has what's known as selective pressure or takeover time. And this basically refers to the time it takes for the best individual and variations of it to take over the entire population. So if you've got a high selective pressure, then the best solution quickly dominates the entire population. But if you've got a low selective pressure, then the takeover time is long, and it's going to take a longer time for that individual to dominate the entire population. So that's very important. Now, usually when you've got a high selective pressure, as I've said, short takeover time, and this decreases diversity very, very quickly. And then, of course, you also have low selective pressure, which has a long takeover time. It takes longer for the best individual to dominate the entire population, and this, of course, increases diversity. And now you might ask, which of the two do we want? And that's a good question. The answer to that is it depends. So you want a very good balance between the two. You don't want too high selective pressure, because then you're going to get stuck in local optimas. But you don't want low selective pressure, because then you're not going to make progress. It's just going to keep on being weak you want improvement over time to come into the population, and you want convergence. You want the algorithm to say, I've come to the solution, I can't make any progress, this might be the best solution to this problem. So the idea is, or the secret is to get a balance between these two concepts. Okay, so let's have a look at a few of these selection strategies. Now the first, of course, is random. So in this case, you've got the same probability for any individual to be chosen. It's 1 over ns, where ns, of course, is your population size. So if you've got 10 individuals, anyone has a 10% chance of being selected. Now, when it comes to your takeover time and your selective pressure, can you guess what this is? Of course, lowest selective pressure possible. It has a high exploration and low exploitation in the algorithm. Now, what does this mean? We'll talk about this term or these two concepts quite a bit in time. But basically, high exploration means that the algorithm explores the entire search space as much as possible. And it does so without any regard really for how good a solution is. It tries to explore as much as possible. And when you've got exploitation, exploitation means that you focus on an individual part of the problem space and try to optimize it as much as possible. Now with random, you've got very low exploitation. In other words, it doesn't try and optimize an area, it just randomly searches as much as possible. So you've got high exploration and low exploitation. That's random selection. Now the next selection scheme is proportional selection. Now with proportional selection, fitter individuals have a greater probability of being selected, and it's proportional to the fitness. So the higher your fitness, the better your fitness, the greater the chances of you being selected. Now let's say we've got a maximization problem. In other words, the bigger the fitness value is, the fitter you are. Then the probability of being selected, so this is what this is, the probability of selecting XIT is simply as follows. The first thing is we've got the scaled fitness function that you see over here. So the scaled fitness function of XIT, and what we talk about scaled is it needs to be positive. So if you also have negative fitness values, you need to make sure that 0 is the lowest that you can possibly go. So that's the scaled fitness function of XIT at the top, and at the bottom, it's the sum of all the fitnesses of all the individuals. So this is just going to give you a fraction, which basically is then going to be the probability of being selected. So let's say everything in the population has a fitness of 0.1. You've got 10 of them. Then what you basically have is 0.1 over 1, and it's 10%. So it's a 10% probability of selecting anything. But if anything is fitter, let's say one of the individuals has a fitness of 0.5. You've got 0.5 over 1. So it has a higher probability of being selected. So in that way, we can assign a probability that every individual is going to get selected. Okay, so now we've got the probability, but we haven't made any selections yet. So for that, we need another algorithm. And one of the easiest ones to understand that works quite well is roulette wheel selection. Now with roulette wheel selection, you start with, let's quickly go through the algorithm. We start with a chromosome index, I equals 1, and then we calculate the probability, like we've just seen using that equation. So now we know what's the probability of selecting X1T. And then we have this variable called sum, and we set it equal to that value. And then we choose a random value between 0 and 1, and that must be chosen uniformly. So that's how this whole process starts. You've got your index, you calculate the probability, you have this extra variable sum, and you've got this variable r. And now we go into this while loop, and the while loop says while sum is smaller than r. Now the idea with this is if your probability is very high, the probability that it's going to be less than r is going to diminish depending on how high that probability is. So if the probability is very, very high, it's going to skip this while loop altogether and then immediately return that value. Return x1t, that's the selected individual. However, if it's smaller than that random value that you've chosen, we increment the index. So we're going to go to 2, and perhaps let's see if we're going to choose 2. And then we calculate the probability of selecting x2t, again using that equation, and we add that to the sum. So sum equals sum plus that probability that you've just calculated. And then we check, is this probability smaller than r? And we keep on going. So the idea is that if an individual has a high probability of being selected, there's a high chance that it will exceed the value of R at some point, and then you're going to return that value. So it's a simple, straightforward algorithm, and in that way we can choose an individual based on that probability. Now, using the standard roulette wheel to replace the entire population via independent function calls causes a high variance in the number of offsprings per individual, to the extent that even the fittest individual might actually fail to reproduce. Now, the easiest way to see this is by the following example. Let's say you've got one individual that has a 10% chance of being selected, a 10% probability, and all the others, let's say 90 of them, only has a 1% chance to be selected. So one that has a 10% chance, and then all the rest, 1% has a 1% chance. And of course, that all sums to 1. So that seems all fair and likely that the 10% one will be chosen most of the time. But the problem is, if you have a 10% chance to be selected, you also have a 90% chance of not being selected. So it could happen that in, let's say, 10 independent function calls being called, that you are unlucky and it never lands on you. So since there's a 90% chance of not getting selected, you might end off with 10 1% individuals, they'll probably be all different, receiving the chance or getting the chance to reproduce, while the 10% individual, which is 10 times better than everybody else, never gets a chance, simply because these function calls are independent. So that is the biggest criticism of the standard roulette wheel selection scheme. Now, there is an algorithm known as stochastic universal sampling. You can have a look on that on page 137 of Engelbrecht's book, because this solves the problem by pre-calculating the number of offspring which is allowed per individual. And this, of course, allows us to get around this problem. Oh yes, and before I forget, proportional selection scheme, of course, has a high selective pressure because the fitness plays such a crucial role in selecting the individuals. And of course, that implies that you have high exploitation. You're going to optimize those little areas to find the best possible offspring, and you've got low exploration. You're not going to explore much because the fittest individual is going to get a chance to pass on its genes. Now, the next selection scheme is that of tournament selection, and this is by far my favorite, and you'll see now in a moment. So how does this work? It's very simple. The first thing is you select a random subgroup from your main population. So your main population is NS, so you've got maybe, let's say, 10, and an NTS could be something like 3. So NTS is smaller or equal to NS, and that's the subgroup of individuals that you choose randomly from the main population. And once you've done that, you choose the best individual from that group. And that is the element, or that is the individual, the solution, that then is selected from this tournament selection. So for crossover, let's say you're applying crossover, you can use tournament selection each time for each parent, and just to make sure that they're not the same parent. Otherwise, you just have cloning, but we'll get to that. Or you can say, from the subgroup, select the top 2 elements or top 2 individuals, and that's the 2 that I'm going to use in the crossover operator. Now, what's really powerful with the tournament selection is that it can be fine-tuned exactly to what you want. So if you think about it, if NTS is equal to NS, so the entire population becomes your subgroup, and you select the best individual from that, it means you basically have elitism. That's maximum selective pressure. You're choosing the individual with the best fitness every time. That's maximum pressure, selection pressure. Or, and the other way is if NTS is equal to 1. So you just choose one random element, and from that one group of one element, you choose the best, which is itself. That, of course, is completely random. So, and of course, random has the least amount of selective pressure. So by choosing NTS, you can modify this value to get a varied response. So this gives you varied selective pressure depending on how big the group is, which is absolutely fantastic, because now you can strike an equilibrium between your exploration and exploitation. The next selection scheme is pretty straightforward, and this is known as rank-based selection. So what you do is, once you've calculated the fitness of all the individuals, you basically order them from the best to the worst. So the best one is in the first position, and the worst individual, or the worst solution, is at the last position. And then you apply a non-deterministic linear sampling to select an individual xi such that the earlier you are in this array, the higher the probability is of being chosen. Now, one way to do this is using this simple rather straightforward equation over here. So you choose a random value uniformly from 0 to n is minus 1. Okay, and then you choose, and again, a random value from 0 over here to whatever that value used to be. So with this, there's a very high probability of choosing an individual that's earlier on in the array. So the higher you, the more you are in the beginning of the array, the higher the probability is that you're going to get selected. So that is rank-based selection. And it's very useful when the fitnesses are very close together as well, because you will the rank plays a bigger role than simply the position or your overall fitness. And if an individual has a very, very high fitness and it's going to overwhelm all the others because of its high fitness, it still gives the others some probability of being selected, which of course is a good thing. So in terms of selective pressure, it has a lower selective pressure than proportional, but a higher, of course, higher than random. And there's only one exception with rank-based, and that, of course, is if the individuals are very, very close together in fitness, because then rank plays a bigger role, and an individual with ever so slightly better fitness will get a higher probability of being selected. While with proportional, they might be a bit closer together. The next selection scheme is Boltzmann selection. Now, this is loosely based on the thermodynamic principles of simulated annealing. Now, the idea with annealing is that you start with a high temperature, and then you decrease it over time on a specific alloy that hardens the metal because of the way in which the crystalline structures changes, something along those lines. But we're going to try and implement this as a selection scheme. Now, how that works is we calculate the probability of selecting xit as follows. And this is very importantly for a minimization problem. And of course, you can also extend this to a maximization problem. You just have to flip this term around, this fraction around. So how it works is you've got your fitness of your individual over here, fxit, which you divide by a temperature parameter, Tt. Okay, and that temperature variable starts at a very high level. For purposes of illustration, let's say it's near infinite. So if you've got some fitness value, doesn't matter what it is, which you divide by almost infinite value, this term is going to become 0. Because anything divided by a very big number becomes very, very small. So e to the power of 0 is 1. So 1 plus 1 is 2 is 0.5. So almost all individuals will have a 0.5 probability of being chosen. Then, of course, you equalize over that, and everybody has the same probability of being chosen. So that's very, very close to random selection scheme. But then over time, you start decreasing this temperature variable. And as you decrease it, the fitness becomes more and more important. So if the fitness is better, there's a higher chance, bigger probability that you will select that individual. So this TT starts at a high temperature and then slowly decreases. And what makes this very powerful is that it has a low to medium selective pressure, which is time dependent. So you start with a high selective pressure and low selective pressure, and then you decrease that over time so that it actually hones in on the best possible solution. Now with Boltzmann selection, here's a simple graph that just shows you how it works. So it's very, very simple. You're at the top over here. This value that you see in this column over here, or this row, is, let's say, temperatures. You've got 10,000, 1,000, 100, and 10. That's that TT that you see. And over here, in this row over here, we've got fitnesses. So let's say a fitness that ranges from 10 to 300. That's just chosen at random. And now what you see over here, that's calculated in this column, is that probability of selecting an individual if the temperature is 10,000. And you'll see that they're all very close to 0.5. And this is graphed in this blue line over here. So the probability is extremely similar for all the individuals. So that gives you high selective pressure. And that's, of course, exactly what you want. But now the temperature decreases. So now we are at 1,000. Okay, so here we are. and have a look how the temperature or the probability changes. Now it goes from 0.5 to 0.43 rather than from 0.5 to 0.49, and this is this red graph. See, so the probability of selecting something as its fitness decreases goes down much quicker than, for example, the blue line. And here it is for 100. So if the temperature is 100, now it goes from 0.48 to 0.05. So the probability of selecting low fitness of 300, remember this is a minimization problem, it starts high and then goes down quite quickly. And then if we go to a temperature of 10, so it's getting very cool now, now you have this green graph. So the probability drops incredibly fast if your fitness actually gets weaker. And of course, remember, you normalize this. So even though all of these values that you see over here, they don't count up to 1, you're going to divide them by the sum to get an equal probability for all your individuals. And that's Boltzmann selection. So high selective pressure near the end of the algorithm and low selective pressure when the algorithm starts with a high temperature. Now the next selection scheme is that of elitism, and elitism is only really used to preserve the best chromosome in the population. So typically what happens at the end of every iteration, you'll copy typically the best individual, maybe the top 2, but usually only the best one is simply copied over without mutation to the next generation to preserve that genome, and that also avoids the fitness from dropping near the end, because you're not never losing your best candidates. And of course, this is the maximum possible selective pressure, and there's no exploration taking place. You always take the best individual. The next selection scheme is Hall of Fame. Now this is very similar to a list of the best players in an arcade game, if you remember those days. So after every reproduction, the individual or the offspring is inserted into the Hall of Fame if they make the cut. So if they're not good enough, they get discarded. And then the individuals in the Hall of Fame is then the individual that's used for reproduction. And these are the best ones from the very first generation. And this tends to have a very high selective pressure with little exploration and of course high exploitation. But it's heavily dependent on how large this Hall of Fame is. So you might have a population of, let's say, 100, and then your Hall of Fame is only 10, and then only the individuals in that Hall of Fame is then used for reproduction. But of course, it depends on how large that Hall of Fame is. If the Hall of Fame is the same size as the population, then of course your selective pressure is not as high. And if you think back to that generator, that artificial life simulation that I've had with those critters running around, you could regard that as a kind of a Hall of Fame, where the Hall of Fame is equal to the population size, because I randomly choose individuals from that Hall of Fame every time. And if you survive longer, you can reproduce. So that is a kind of a Hall of Fame, if you think about it. That was quite a mouthful. So now we can represent our individuals. We have some kind of representation scheme. We have an initialization phase. We can have a primordial soup of individuals, which are terrible. And we even have a fitness function that can tell us how bad they are. And now we can select individuals. We can select for crossover and mutation, for reproduction. And we can also select in order for them to survive. But we haven't covered reproduction yet, and that of course is the next phase. Now reproduction falls into one of two categories. You have crossover over here, and you've got mutation. Now with crossover, you produce offspring by selecting the genetic material from typically 2 or more parents, and this tends to make quite a bit of radical changes to the chromosome, because you're combining genetic material from multiple individuals together to form new offspring, if you like. As they tend to grow closer, the parents, similar to one another, these changes also become less, of course, and that's what you want. So that's crossover. And then mutation is small random changes in the chromosome, and this is typically kept very, very small, something like 2% or even lower, 1%. So there's a 1% chance that a gene can be altered, and this is usually applied after crossover. So imagine taking half of the one parent, half of the other parent, you create your child, and then there's a 1% probability that you might change any of the individuals inside this genome. And this typically gives you those fine-tuning elements and adds a little bit of diversity to the population. Mutation is a very, very important part of reproduction, but it has to be incredibly small, a very, very small rate of mutation. Otherwise, you're not going to make progress. Your exploration is simply going to be too large. So that's reproduction. And now we've got a working algorithm. But of course, it can't stop yet. So we need to make sure that we can terminate depending on the situation. So you can terminate when an acceptable or even known solution has been found. With known solution, you might wonder, but why don't we just use this known solution? It's more a question of, you know what the perfect solution might look like. So for example, let's say you're creating a genetic algorithm or an evolutionary algorithm to solve a timetable. You know a perfect timetable will have no clashes. So you know when a solution has been found. But you might not know what that solution is. So that's what's known as an acceptable or known solution. Or you can terminate when no improvement is observed over a number of consecutive generations. So let's say the best fitness is 0.24 and it has been 0.24 for, let's say, 100 generations. Then you can say, okay, if there isn't any more changes, we can stop after that. You can also stop when there's no change in the population. That's similar to the above, but the idea with this is that if one individual has completely taken over the population, then of course you can also stop, or when the objective function slope is approximately 0. So the idea with this is it's pretty much the same. The idea is the objective function, of course, is the function we're trying to optimize, and if the slope of that is approaching 0, it means that there's no change. So then of course you can also stop. Now you can also stop after a set number of iterations or after some time, but that's usually not used in practice because you don't know when to stop and you don't know how many generations you require. But of course, typically when your evolutionary algorithm is in a loop of its own, so in other words, maybe you are comparing evolutionary algorithms with one another, maybe in a grid search or trying to optimize parameters, then it could happen that you say, okay, run this algorithm for a minute, let's have a look at the results, and then decide if we're going to tune the parameters a bit more to try again. So in those cases, stopping after a set number of iterations or after a certain time has elapsed, then it makes sense. But usually, if your algorithm is implemented to find a solution and then stop, stopping based on time or number of generations is not advised. There are better ways to stop your algorithm. Okay, and that essentially is evolutionary algorithms. And some of the main differences between your classical optimization techniques and your EAs is, first of all, if we look at the search space, okay, the search space transition for your classical optimization, it's deterministic. You know exactly how to move from one step to the next in order to make progress. With EAs, it's all probabilistic. You don't know how the changes are going to be. It might change in one direction, it might change in another, but it's not deterministic. The type of search is also different. So for COs, classical optimization, it's sequential. You make progress, you move on to the next part of the problem, and you make progress in that way. With EAs, and this is a huge advantage, it's parallel, because you have multiple parents or multiple individuals in the population, and each one of them might be optimizing a different part of the problem. And of course, you can literally parallelize this as well on multiple CPUs to make it even faster. But it's not a sequential process. It's parallel, and one part of the population might make changes to one area, while another makes changes to another area, and then over time they might combine that. But that's the whole nature of how EAs work. Initialization is also different. So with classic optimization, typically a single point, you start at the problem and then you moves towards a solution. So there's a single point where you start. But with EAs, you've got multiple diverse parts. Remember, your initialization phase, that is initialized to all kinds of random points, and I mean that's that difference. And then search-based information. So how do we solve the problem? With your classical optimization, it's first and second order derivatives. For example, if you look at something like gradient descent, that uses a classic first order derivative, in order to find the direction of the slope in which you need to move in order to optimize it. It's an absolute deterministic movement. With EAs, it's only the fitness values. So the fitness values, the fitness function determines, and that guides the search in which direction you could possibly go in search. And of course, because it's probabilistic in nature, it might not even, follow the fitness function. It might follow a completely different route. But that's the only part that actually guides the evolutionary algorithm. That's the main differences. And that's evolutionary algorithms. So it's an incredibly powerful problem-solving technique. And I hope you've got some understanding of how the generic EA now works. In the next slide, or the next lecture, we'll have a look specifically at genetic algorithms. We're going to look at a few examples of how we can solve some simple problems using this technique. So thank you for watching. If you've got any questions, you can leave them in the comments or you can mail me directly. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one. Keep well.